I was walking through the fires of hell, delighted with the enjoyments of genius, which to angels look like torment and insanity. William Blake. Big artistic movements are inherently rebellious, and 19th century European Romanticism was no exception. For the previous 200 years, art reflected the values of the Age of Enlightenment. It presented a world in which reason and science had tamed life's brutality. But to the Romantics, this was an empty vision. It just didn't track with their own lived experiences. They saw the compulsion to create order out of chaos as artificial and stifling. They believed it was more rational, or at least more true to life, for artists to embrace the irrational. Subjectivity, fantasy, and the dark, mysterious realm of the subconscious. These were the best paths to the truth. In this context, the notion that alcohol, drugs, and even madness give us special insights quickly became a popular theme in Romantic art. Thomas de Quincey's autobiographical novel Confessions of an English Opium Eater became a runaway bestseller, inspiring a young, unknown French musician named Hector Berlioz to compose his Symphonie Fantastique. Francisco Goya filled what were later called his black paintings with haunting, nightmarish visions. And in her poem, Much Madness is Divinest Sense, Emily Dickinson celebrated the disobedient, escapist spirit of the age. Much madness is divinest sense. To a discerning eye, much sense, the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this, as all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demur, you're straightway dangerous, and handled with a chain. Robert Schumann struggled with mental illness for most of his adult life. His letters and diaries provide lots of personal information, but it's hard to accurately diagnose someone born more than 200 years ago. He veered wildly between astonishing bursts of activity and long depressions, the classic symptoms of bipolar disorder. On the other hand, we know he contracted syphilis when he was 21. Some researchers have pointed to the hand injury that ended his career as a pianist as evidence of syphilitic nerve damage, and the hallucinations that accompanied his final mental collapse are indicative of the disease in its horrifying terminal stage. There's also the possibility that his doctors inadvertently poisoned him. In the mid-19th century, the standard treatment for syphilis was doses of arsenic and mercury. By the time Schumann was in his 40s, the concentration of heavy metals in his system was certainly high enough to send him off the deep end. It's important to remember that the idea of mental instability aiding artistic production is mostly a conceit. Creating long-form works requires incredible control and focus. Any serious illness is a liability. And when we look for obvious connections between Schumann's music and his long descent into insanity, we run into dead ends. The romantic stereotype of the mad musical genius who produces wild-sounding music doesn't fit him. Even his most adventurous pieces show a respect for boundaries. The fact is, Schumann was ambivalent about Romanticism. He championed progressive artistic priorities like originality, poetic fantasy, and subjective expression. But he also valued tradition. He was strongly attached to the idea that music should be broadly understandable. He was, like his peers, painfully aware of Beethoven's legacy, particularly in the field of instrumental music. But Schumann's attempts to build on that foundation yielded mixed results. He never quite realized that the tools Beethoven used to create his works had lost their relevance. Harmonies are to music as colors are to painting. The more of them you use, the less contrast you get. The classic symphonies, concertos, and sonatas were built on limited harmonic outlines. A composer would establish a key, take a few steps away from it for contrast, and then return home. Listeners could sense a large-scale structure without knowing how it was built. But by the early 19th century, a system of tuning instruments called equal temperament was becoming the norm. It allowed composers to jump to and from any harmony they wished without ending up on chords that were intolerably out of tune. Schumann and his colleagues loved indulging themselves in these newly available colors. But in doing so, they undermined the old structures. They overlooked the extent to which Beethoven's Romanticism was based in the procedures of the 18th century. The pianist Charles Rosen summarized the problem. Contemplating the achievement of Beethoven, Schumann clearly felt a sense of shame. By comparison, his own works and those of his colleagues seemed trivial. There were, he wrote, too many composers of nocturnes, bagatelles, dances, and characteristic pieces. What was needed was symphonies, sonatas, quartets, in short, the sublime. Schumann persisted in trying to adapt the classical models, to twist his own style to fit the mold, perhaps never realizing that the faith Beethoven held in harmonic balance and in an equilibrium of large-scale proportions was no longer tenable. Schumann completed his cello concerto in A minor on October 24, 1850. It had taken him less than 2 weeks to write the piece. He was feeling optimistic. At the age of 40, he'd just landed his first major job, municipal music director of Düsseldorf. It gave him the opportunity to finally put his career on solid footing. But the glow surrounding his appointment didn't last. He'd always been a spectacularly ineffective conductor, and he was only able to hold on to the job because people respected him so much as a musician. His decision to write a large-scale piece for cello and orchestra was unusual. The last significant cello concertos had been written by Haydn, and among Schumann's successors over the next 100 years, only Dvorak and Elgar would make lasting contributions to the genre. He had a particular affection for the instrument. He learned to play it, passably, and even considered trying to become a professional cellist when his right hand became unfit for piano playing. Schumann originally called his concerto a concert piece. This was a sort of catch-all term for works that were concerto-like, but weren't laid out in the usual form. He passionately believed that the best music takes us onto an elevated plane, and he felt the conventional pauses between concerto movements simply brought listeners back to earth. So he fashioned a piece in which the standard 3-movement form is telescoped into a continuous single-movement work. His eventual decision to label it a concerto was just a nod to tradition. The work wasn't performed during his lifetime, and it remained obscure well into the 20th century. The concerto is a heroic form. It's about the triumph of one extraordinarily capable person over the mob. But Schumann didn't associate that idea with the cello. For him, the instrument was essentially soulful and lyrical. It was the voice of introspective romanticism. His concerto only became popular as part of a larger movement to hear and assess Schumann's music on its own terms, and to appreciate the expressive subtlety and formal ingenuity that makes the piece such a compelling example of his unique creative gifts.